live.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Okay, everybody, good evening. It's Saturday night at 8 o'clock. And my guest for tonight is Tim Canova, running in the Florida 23rd as an independent in one of the most important congressional races in the nation. So thank you very much for showing up for our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Joe. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you, Tim. Yes, it is always a pleasure. Of course, I'm here for Real Progressives. I have to mention that. I think I forgot to mention it.
Wow. I love my friends at Real Progressive.
And your friends here love you as well, Tim.
Thanks.
It's a mutual admiration society.
It really is. Well, I know I'm feeling it towards Real Progressives.
So we're going to have a ball tonight. What I'd like to start with is, I know you've got some comments on Syria.
Yeah, I have made some comments about Syria. I find it rather distressing. The rush to judgment fits a pattern that's been going on for way too long in the United States of America, where we rush into attacking another country, to getting involved militarily, based on allegations that are not yet substantiated. And there are a lot of folks who will say, well, this is nonsense. Of course, it was the Assad regime that engaged in the chemical weapon attack. Well, if it was, let's take the time to have a real investigation from credible experts. Credible experts exist. The United Nations has an organization for the prevention of chemical weapons, that are filled with very good scientists who have investigated these kinds of allegations in the past. And why the rush to judgment? Why not allow the experts to conduct an investigation, find out the facts before reaching conclusions? I'm sorry, that organization is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I misspoke.
Yes.
And, we saw this happen before in the Iraq War. We saw it happen with the Vietnam War, where you've gotten an official narrative that is forced down our throats, so to speak, and that everyone feels they have to fall into line and just accept the official narrative without any real due diligence and investigation. Now, that's not the rule of law. That's not due process, and it shouldn't be the American way. And I think we've made some grave mistakes in our foreign policy, and not just harmed millions of other people around the world, but we've harmed so many American military personnel and their families by stumbling into the wrong wars at the wrong time. And these unsubstantiated allegations get repeated as if they're fact, and they get repeated by a corporate media, and anyone who dissents is marginalized or criticized for dissenting. And dissent is, first of all, what should be central to our country as Americans: the right to dissent, the duty to dissent. And beyond that, the Constitution gives Congress the responsibility to decide to wage war and to oversee war making through its budgetary oversight. And Congress has largely abdicated its responsibility. I think many in both parties cheered on this rush to war. And then when President Trump actually announces he's firing missiles, a lot of folks suddenly wake up and say, wait, that shouldn't be happening without a congressional debate and discussion and vote. But the drums of war had been beating for quite a while before Donald Trump ever got up there and announced he was engaging in this missile attack. So that was the gist of my statement about Syria, that a time like this, more than any other time, our elected representatives in Congress should be asking tough questions and investigating. And that should precede any use of American military force.
Yes, right. And since that time, of course, we have had the use, of American military force, using the authorization for the use, of military force again. The same justification we have always used since 2002.
Right. And look how out of touch it is. That authorization in 2002 was essentially to help fight al-Qaeda, right, because of the September 11th attacks.
Exactly.
Where's al-Qaeda on here? Al-Qaeda is on the opposite side of the Assad regime in Syria. ISIS, the Islamic State, is on the opposite side of the Assad regime in Syria. So the administration, like the previous administration, acts as if that 2002 military authorization should apply to each and every situation we could possibly find ourselves in anywhere in the world. So under President Obama, we were bombing, 7 countries with drones on a daily basis without authorizations.
Yes, it's just outrageous, and Congress has to take back some control in this area. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure when you get to Congress, and hopefully there are a lot of others like you, or who agree with you on this, who will be coming to Congress also, perhaps we can get some constitutional control of the war-making power back. Mm-hmm. The Constitution says Congress has to declare war. Mm-hmm. And it has been, since the Truman administration kind of ended that, we're now nearly 70 years later. Yeah. It's nearly 70 years later, and Congress still hasn't taken back its constitutional power. And the question, which arises is, when is the public going to learn? When are we going to start to understand that when the government cries wolf, there isn't necessarily any wolf out there? We need to have proof, because they have amply proved time and time and time again that they cannot be trusted. The corporate media has proved time and time and time again that it cannot be trusted. So why are we doing this? I have no idea why my picture went dark, but can you hear me?
I hear you and I see you.
Oh, and you see me also. So the question is, why have I gone dark? I have no idea. Well, maybe I'll become light again.
Well, I hope so. I will be praying for the lightness to come your way.
Oh, well, thank you very much. But as long as people can hear me, it's all right. So.
Loud and clear.
So anyway, that's the position on Syria you're taking. And I know you'll be very active in trying to build popular support for that kind of position. And I hope that all of us will be very active in letting the Trump administration actually know that we're not going to tolerate any further intervention there, that we want out of there. We want out of most of these wars. And perhaps we want out of all of these wars. The public opinion on this still has to be explored, but I have a feeling that the public at large is tired to death of foreign wars that are undeclared wars, that are wars that happen because of a lobby inside of the federal government that needs to be leashed.
Yes. Speaking of those lobbies, I tweeted this afternoon two things. First of all, I saw that there's an estimate that $212 million of missiles were fired off by the United States in the past 24 hours. So that's a lot of revenue for the companies that are supplying us with these missiles. And I also tweeted that the stock value of the missile makers have gone up $5 billion overnight. So it was reminiscent of a book written long ago by Smedley Butler. He had been the highest ranking Marine in American history at the time. And he wrote a book in the 1930s called War is a Racket.
Yes, and also Smedley Butler was the person who foiled the coup d'etat plot.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Please, I'm sure a lot of folks are not aware of that coup d'etat plot. We should really go into it and speak about a little bit of hidden American history.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, my understanding, you correct me if I'm off base at all, but my understanding is that Smedley Butler was approached by a Wall Street bond trader from a big Wall Street company and offered a deal that the Wall Street folks would put up something like $1 million, I think, and help raise an army of 1 million folks or within the army. And Butler would lead the coup against the newly elected President Franklin Roosevelt. And Butler played along with the coup plotters for a while to try to ascertain more of their identities. And then he blew the whistle very loud. And there were congressional hearings at the time. It implicated a Wall Street firm, a big one. I think it was Brown Brothers Harriman, if I remember correctly. And Butler, I think after that, came out with his book, War is a Racket, which was an indictment of U.S. foreign policy. He said things that, for instance, that he had helped overthrow governments all over Central America, Asia, and South America in the interests of United Fruit, big petroleum companies, big oil companies, big Wall Street banks, and he was quite a character. He was a truth teller, somebody who, again, was the highest decorated Marine in American history at the time.
Yes, he was a truth teller, and he was a hero, and he was a real patriot. And in some ways, he's the reason why we have any social safety net at all today, because without FDR, there would have been no safety net.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And there might not have been a victory in World War II. A lot of history would have been changed had Franklin Roosevelt been overthrown in year one in a military coup.
Absolutely. Just really incredible. And not only that, but a military coup with the power behind the throne being the plutocrats.
Well, and isn't that the definition of fascism? When there's no space between the corporate oligarchs and the state, and they use their alliance to crush labor unions and social democracy and dissent.
Right, and doesn't that also mean that we're perilously close to that state, okay, at this point, if not already there?
If not already there, my friend, absolutely.
In other words, it only remains for them to snuff out our civil liberties and our civil rights, and we're there.
Yeah, it certainly does not look like a functioning democracy when the will of the people is ignored, not just at the ballot box quite often, but in the halls of Congress and state legislatures, where the power of corporate money holds greater sway than the will of the people. It doesn't look like much of a democracy at all right now.
No, not to me. And of course, we're doing all we can to change that, and you are doing all you can to change it.
Well, we're part of I think we're part of a great movement, you and I, and those who are watching and listening in right now. This is such an important movement and such an important crossroads in American history right now. We're fighting for the future of democracy, and that's not hyperbole. That is the reality. At a time when it's so much easier for people to turn away, maybe be depressed or demoralized or distracted, but not to be engaged and committed. And I'm so gratified to be part of this movement of people who are standing up and not giving up.
You made a lot of us happy. Was it 2 weeks ago now? Okay.
2 weeks ago, real soon, yeah.
When you decided that you had enough,
yeah, and
you were going to declare as an independent
took a lot.
candidate.
It took a lot to get me there, Joe.
I know it did. They they hit you again, and they hit you again, and they hit you harder, and they hit you again, and they kept on hitting you, and they would never stop, even when you showed that they were engaged in criminal activity.
It's true.
They still wouldn't stop. And so you finally decided you weren't going to be the victim of criminal activity anymore, and you decided to run as an independent.
Yes. And the grassroots, the enthusiasm, the response from around the district and around the country has been overwhelmingly positive. And I must say, it feels like a great relief off my shoulders as well. I feel it feels like a liberation, quite frankly. I feel free to speak much more forthrightly on the issues and to not worry about how it plays out in a rather narrow range of opinion within the establishment wing of the Democratic Party and their corporate media caretakers.
Okay, so I had some other questions to ask you relating to your campaign and the platform of your campaign. From our earlier discussion, I don't think we covered very much of your overall foreign policy ideas. You're obviously very displeased with the war policies that we engage in, and the aggressive policies. What would you put in their place?
We need to have a very active peace agenda that seeks to engage the rest of the world in discussions leading to negotiated agreements on arms reduction. And I don't just mean weapons of mass destruction. Of course, there should be agreements on reducing weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological, but in addition, conventional arms reductions, right down to the bullets and the AK-47s and AR-15s and all kinds of military assets. And we need to have a global conversion plan. I remember when the Cold War seemed to have ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and for this brief shining moment, wasn't that shining, but it was a brief moment of hope that we were going to have a peace dividend. You remember that slogan?
I remember it very well.
Okay, and that we were going to really start converting to civilian needs in our economy, and we were going to have a Marshall Plan for the former Soviet Union. None of that happened. Instead, the former Soviet Union got privatized and created a billionaire, oligarch, plutocratic class overnight. And in this country, the peace dividend never really happened either. Instead, you had an era of mass incarceration, a war on drugs, a lot of private prison building. And beyond that, what else do you see in this country at the same time that we don't get the peace dividend? You see new enemies that are created and pop out of the woodwork, you could say. And the focus goes from an East-West struggle to the war on terror. And, there's a lot that could be analyzed in this. When our closest ally for much of those years, Saudi Arabia, is the regime itself that is propagating and spreading a lot of the ideologies of hate and the infrastructure of violence that we then start fighting. And it seems like this has been the business plan in the United States, is to arm every side of every war, perhaps. So we need a peace agenda, but Joe, I think it's not going to be possible without two things. One is a conversion program so that these very powerful interests, what Eisenhower referred to as a military-industrial complex, maybe now it's a military industrial intelligence complex, that it converts to civilian use, that it still is treated fairly well and comfortably, because you don't want them revolting from this. Give them some cost plus contracts, but not to build conventional arms, but to work on the next era of a space program, whether it's exploring planets like Mars, or it's building the kinds of infrastructure that can ward off any incoming asteroids. As unlikely as it is, it only takes one asteroid getting through for Earth to have a bad day and for the human species to be wiped out. Why not put all that spending that's going into the military and start converting it overnight into a really beefed up space program, so that there's not an enormous backlash against this peace agenda? And then at the same time, I think we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. It has worked in South Africa. It has worked in converting from apartheid South Africa to post-apartheid. It was used in Guatemala to heal the wounds of a long, bloody civil war. A lot of folks maybe won't be happy that what we're suggesting with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an amnesty for war criminals, essentially. But in return, those folks have to speak truthfully, have full and complete confessions as to their nature of their crimes, and apologize for it, essentially, if we're going to move on. It might not satisfy those who fantasize about putting these folks in jail. I would suggest, again, if there's any chance to move to a more peaceful agenda for the United States and for the world, it can't be necessarily having a vindictive, punishing type of an attitude towards those who have led us down this terrible path. There's got to be an attempt for reconciliation to help them see the error of their ways. We live, I think, in a plutocracy and an oligarchy right here, where the wealthiest families have more wealth and income than they can spend if they lived a million lifetimes. And at some point, we have to appeal to their sense of justice and fairness and decency and humanity to put an end to this type of orgy of greed, and to start treating human beings the way they would want to be treated if they were not born into the lap of luxury themselves.
It's a delicate balance, Tim. Okay, a lot of different things have to be balanced. And also, there has to be some fear, okay, on their part, that if they don't agree to act in a decent manner, that then things can get real ugly extremely fast. Okay, and unless they realize that's a real possibility and that we're serious about that, I don't think that the reconciliation era you're talking about is going to occur.
I don't
for that.
Yeah, but Joe, I don't think they're going to feel that sense of fear based on Americans coming out into the streets and protesting necessarily. I don't know. Let me just say, as somebody who took part in the Occupy movement and the anti-corporate globalization movement, right, the spirit of Seattle and all of that, and you go back, I'm sure, the Vietnam War, civil rights protests. Certainly, we need mass mobilization and protest, but we also need success at the ballot box. Both of them.
I agree. I wasn't attempting to suggest we did not need the success at the ballot box. What I'm envisioning is a situation where we have really radical success at the ballot box.
Right.
And we also have the movements in the streets.
Yes.
Okay, and then they begin to see the alternatives, including the reconciliation alternative. I'm saying, in that kind of environment, they may be ready to accept a reconciliation.
Yes,
as the preferable solution.
I hope so. And it might sound utopian to speak this way, but the world is changing very quickly, and conditions for millions and millions of people, the majority of people in this country and around the world, are not easy conditions to live in. And I do think that a lot of the conditions are ripe for some very far-reaching changes to happen very quickly, I think. It could have happened last year or 2 years ago. Had Bernie Sanders managed to win that nomination, I don't think we'd have been looking at a Republican administration or a Republican House or Senate, quite frankly.
Yes, I agree. I agree. It could have happened in 2009 also, if
Yes.
the president had acted in a very different way. If he
Yes.
had made use of the energy out there and the
Instead of
feelings of desperation.
Instead of a Larry Summers and a Timothy Geithner by his side, a James Galbraith,
Yes,
folks like that who were talking sense
exactly.
about expanding Social Security and having public jobs programs. That would have been the path to go on in 2009.
That would have been the path to go on, okay, in 2009. And of course, never, never, never to insist that it's okay, fellas, I'm standing between you, okay, and everybody else.
Right.
I'm going to protect you. When he said that, he basically took away any incentive on their part to do anything else except behave in the same way they've been behaving.
That's right. And look at the protection. I'll protect you if you'll take hundreds of billions of dollars of TARP money, and you'll get to keep your bonuses, by the way. That's some protection. Yes. It sounds like a protection racket is what it sounds like.
Right. And it sounds like someone who simply gave into a protection racket.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that was pretty bad. Okay, so I think we understand the dimensions and scope of the foreign policy that you have in mind.
Well, yes, and
I might add that in terms of giving the multinationals something else to do, the exploration of the sea is also something that really represents significant scientific challenges for the large companies as well, not simply the exploration, of space. So that's another frontier that can keep them busy and profitable for a long time to come. And I think they also might have a role to play in the transition to a green economy.
Yes,
as well. So I think on the positive side, there are a lot of things for them to do, and it's not just in one area.
Yeah.
So they can have a bright future if they get out of the war business.
Right.
But of course, there are some parts of the military-industrial complex who don't have anything else to do. In other words, the people who actually go to fight these wars as the mercenary forces working for the United States and working for the allies of the United States, they won't have anything else to do, and it's difficult to think of how they might be handled, except in a very forceful way.
We talk a lot about the need for a New Deal in this country, and a Green New Deal and a Solar New Deal, but the idea of a New Deal is the idea that the government, the federal government, can act as the employer of last resort, the way it acts as the lender of last resort. That's what I believe the essence of the New Deal was. 11 million public sector jobs that built this country and built, basically built men out of boys and women out of girls. It gave dignity to people who needed work. We need that in this country, but something, they need it south of the border, in Mexico, in the Central American states, all over Latin America. They need it all over the Middle East. These are young populations coming of age without job opportunities, millions of young men mostly being lured into mercenary armies or into drug cartels, gangs. We need to be converting all of this negative energy into very positive directions. And when we talk about a foreign policy, I think it has to be connected to that vision of a New Deal, and to be a good neighbor, as Franklin Roosevelt called it, the good neighbor policy, to encourage progressive policy, progressive politics south of our border, for instance, to have a Marshall Plan or Marshall Plans for other countries. After all, the Marshall Plan did not just rebuild Western Europe, it helped the American economy tremendously at the same time.
Yes, it did. But we're also here getting into the area of the federal job guarantee idea. And that idea is gaining momentum in polling, the recent polling. It is showing that the idea of a job guarantee is more popular than Medicare for all.
It doesn't surprise me, quite frankly. it doesn't surprise me at all. There are millions of Americans that have no medical coverage, and they might want a Medicare for all. But there's a lot of folks who already have some kind of coverage, and maybe they might not feel the urgency of a Medicare for all. But such a large part of the population, I'm not going to say they're unemployed, but they're underemployed. This has been a low-functioning economy for a long time. I think this is year 10 of a Great Depression. For Wall Street, for asset prices, these are good times, and they have been for years now. But for most other folks in this country, they're not listed as unemployed. They're either dropping out of the job market, they're discouraged workers, or more likely, they're working 2 or 3 part-time jobs, they're consultants looking for full-time jobs, they're driving Ubers. This is not an economy that's producing enough jobs at decent incomes for folks.
You're right, and that is no way to live.
No, and it's affecting every age group.
Gig economy, that's no way to live.
Yeah, and it's affecting every age group. And when you start having seriously high underemployment levels, statistically, it correlates with all kinds of other social pathologies, higher homicide and suicide rates, spousal abuse, domestic violence, alcoholism, drug abuse, all this stuff, all these externalities that result from people who are living, you could say quiet lives of desperation, right? Folks who are living not the American dream, but a lot of broken dreams and struggling to make ends meet and feeling demoralized because their dignity is robbed in many ways. And I've seen it for many years from all walks of life and from every age group at this point. We did not treat the last 10 years like we were in a Great Depression. And I believe it has been a jobs depression, and we're in year 10 of it now.
Well, the labor participation ratio now is something like 63%. And at the height of the economy during the Bush administration, which to my mind was not a very good economy anyway.
Exactly.
We had a labor participation ratio of 67%.
Yeah.
At that time. That 4% means many millions of people. And if you look at the unemployed according to the U3 and the underemployed in terms of the U6, and then you look at the dropouts from the labor force, you're looking at 24 million people who most probably would be available for work if there were a federal job guarantee program available. There are questions about the federal job guarantee program in terms of the rates that would be paid in such a program. The latest research coming out from Levy and from the Sanders Institute is suggesting a wage of about $15 an hour without cost adjustments across the country. Okay, and also, simply $15 an hour and no cost adjustments.
And that would put pressure on big private sector employers if they want to retain their salaried, their wage workers to meet that federal standard, so to speak.
Yes, it would put some pressure on that, but that still is not a living wage.
Right.
In other words, if you want to get to a living wage, it has to be cost adjusted.
Yes,
across the country. Perhaps the $15 an hour is a living wage in the lowest cost area of the country. But on the average, it has to be an $18 to $20 an hour living wage.
And Joe, the way I see it is that if there's a federal jobs guarantee, imagine it's sort of like the New Deal. What was the first jobs program in the New Deal? In the first week, I think it was the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yes, it was.
Immediately took 90,000, or was it 250,000? I'm a little confused, but it was tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of young men, young boys, 18-year-olds mostly to 25, and gave them relatively low-skilled jobs, trained them for the low-skilled jobs, gave them a lot of fresh air, sent them out to the countryside, to the public forest, the national forests and the national parks, and had them cutting fire lines, building firewalls, putting out small fires before they became big fires, interacting with other young boys and becoming men, putting something like 18 pounds of meat on their bones, giving them 3 square meals a day. A lot of them weren't getting that. And something like 90% of what they were being paid, I think there was a requirement. It had to go back to the cities where they came from to help support their families, their parents, their siblings. Those are low-skill jobs. Maybe a low wage, relatively, $15 an hour might seem okay. Whereas if the federal government was also at the same time, as part of this jobs guarantee, subsidizing local school teacher salaries, paying for more local school teachers around the country. This is what John Kennedy called for in 1960. I think it would go a long way to helping improve our public schools, K-12, and even pre-K, rather tremendously. I was very blessed to go to a great public school system, K-12, and I don't see it.
Yeah, so was I.
I don't see it anymore. Those are exceptions, right? And when I went to K-12, not only were you taught, the whole range of classes you'd expect, but maybe you don't expect it now, music, arts, those kinds of programs have been cut in our public schools all over the country. And the class sizes are too big, and the teachers are paid too little. And here in Broward County, in my district, I kid you not, the classrooms, too many classrooms have mold in them, and hundreds of children and teachers and staff get sick every week. Meanwhile, the Broward County voters voted overwhelmingly for a bond issue a few years ago for $800 million to repair the schools, to repair the physical infrastructure of the schools, and the school boards have hardly spent any of that money, which begs the question, why? Our public officials actually engaged in some kind of planning for failure, austerity for the public sector so that the private sector, the charter schools, can come in and make a profit. It's shameful what's happening, and it's not surprising that a lot of people have those suspicions now.
So, when we get down to the job guarantee, we've already discussed that you very much favor a Medicare for All bill, and you favor a job guarantee.
I do.
As well.
I have for a long time. I was with the National Jobs for All Coalition in New York City in the 1990s. I was their first executive director, and I've supported the Conyers bill for many years. So absolutely, that I'd say is a real central feature of our campaign, is the idea calling for a central part of the agenda being a jobs guarantee, a federal jobs guarantee, jobs for all.
Okay, a federal job guarantee at a living wage. But yes. The MMT notions about a federal job guarantee also specify that the jobs would be defined by the local communities, by stakeholders inside of local communities, including the participants in the program themselves. Mm-hmm. Do you favor that as well?
Sounds very wise. It sounds great. I mean, if the stakeholders at the local level are the ones that are determining the jobs, presumably the jobs will meet local needs. Whereas if it's all determined in Washington, D.C., you could imagine a lot going wrong.
Okay, well, there's also another specification, and that is that the jobs be explicitly defined as social enterprises for producing goods and services that fulfill the public purpose. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, doing things for private profit would be excluded from the program.
Sounds great.
A new sector of the economy would be defined such that there would be a market sector, there would be a government sector, and there would be something that we could call a social value sector of the economy, which would be built up through the JEG program. Okay, so Would you work for that in Congress?
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I don't think a federal jobs program should be fulfilling private functions at all. They should have a public benefit, no doubt. And if it can be used to build up sort of the type of cooperative economy, you could say, a social sector, that would be wonderful. Long overdue.
Yes, it could be, so long as the local authorities were willing to work in order to develop these social enterprises as cooperative types of enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then the question arises, of course, well, from that and a lot of other things, okay, that we said, okay, the question arises about how we're going to pay for it. And, okay, so last time I told you about overt congressional financing,
mm-hmm.
and I presented you with some language about that at the time. Have you had any further thoughts about that since?
My understanding of it, according to my understanding, I like it. Essentially, it's saying that we're not going to worry about the deficits when it comes to these spending programs because these concerns about deficit spending and trying to pay as you go are arbitrary and counterproductive. I think I've been engaged in discussions with MMT folks for more than 20 years, since I met Warren Mosler in the mid-1990s and Randy Ray. So, you know, I've been a fellow traveler for a long time. I think I got there through a different route, which was studying economic history and the ideas of Abba Lerner and functional finance. Lerner was writing during the 30s and 40s, and his functional finance was really a masterpiece, the rules of functional finance. And when you take a look at the economic history, the period he was writing during, the 1940s, when at its peak, federal deficit spending was 10 times larger than today, maybe, and the national debt was also much higher, and yet government spending, federal government spending, was twice as high as a percentage of GDP. Unemployment rates fell by the end of World War II during that decade to absolutely full employment, something like 1.2%, I think. And I think the roof didn't cave in on that generation because of all that spending at all. In fact, you know, and I think we talked about this last time I was on, the work of Kenneth Boulding and the grants economy, and the idea that these fiscal programs, right? Who was it? It was Alvin Hansen, who had his fiscal seminar at fiscal policy seminar at Harvard. These were introducing the ideas of Keynes. And Kenneth Boulding's views were that in the grants economy, when the government spends money in grants, such as the GI Bill and the Marshall Plan, they quite often pay for themselves many times over in putting unproductive resources to work, making them into tax-paying resources. We just shouldn't be hampered by this narrow short-term accounting straitjacket. And that's what I love about MMT. And MMT flushes it out in a very thorough theoretical framework. And a lot of folks embrace that theoretical analysis, and I applaud them for it. For those who don't want to get so abstract, what might seem abstract to them, I would say that, you know, just taking a look at it, U.S. economic history confirms what MMT is preaching, which is that there does not need to be any financial constraints on our fiscal policies. Okay, so let me put up the following then. Okay, in discussing this with people, okay, a number of people, it soon became clear that some people were concerned about the language I was using, which was for legislation. Right. And that they thought that if that were used in a forum situation, okay, or in a debate situation, it wouldn't really be possible for the candidates
to give an answer that sounded plausible to people and that was simple enough, okay, for them to instantly grasp. Yes. So I worked on that, and I developed some other language.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to display on the screen now the briefest version, okay, of what I have.
I like it. I like that brief version. And so it is easier to explain than what you had for OCF, for overt congressional financing. It is easier to explain. And, also one way to explain it is that the Fed found trillions of dollars for Wall Street, to the QE programs and the low interest loans. So certainly the Fed can give Treasury some money to help us on our fiscal policies.
Okay, so this is basically a 15-second answer.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay, we're the Congress, and we're going to order the Fed to give Treasury the money.
It's perfect.
And then
I love it.
Article 1, Section 8. Yeah. Okay, it doesn't really involve even MMT. Okay, any sense? It only involves Article 1, Section 8. Hey.
Right, I love it. It's really good, Joe.
We're the Congress. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this one. Okay. And now here's a second one, which is a little more complicated. Okay, this is maybe a minute answer. If it takes one a minute to go through, it has the same question, and it says,
"Yeah, looks good."
Easy. When we pass a spending bill, we'll just order the Fed to immediately add new dollars to the Treasury's account to pay for new spending and repaying the debt as we go along until it is eventually gone. Okay, so that's a little more complicated, but it makes for a lengthier and more formal answer. Okay, if you need one. Okay, kind of spells it out. Okay, a little more. Okay, now these, of course, are not at all set in stone. In other words, they're for people to customize, okay, in their own way.
Yeah.
Of course.
No, I like these. I do think it is, these are easier explanations than what you had before. I do think so. I love my MMT folks. I really do. They have to understand that it might take folks a long time to become more conversant with MMT theory and be able to talk about it in a very intelligent way. And I know that some MT folks get frustrated that the rest of the world hasn't caught up to these insights. As somebody, again, who was talking to people like Warren Mosler and Randy Ray so many years ago, it could take a long time for folks to really start grasping MMT in its fullest complexities. And in the meantime, you got to find easier ways to explain it. And I've quite often, as you saw, go to economic history.
Yes.
Nostalgia, and I think for some good reason. Trump tapped into it, right, with Make America Great Again. We know that our country, while it did terrible things in the past, it also had some moments where it saved mankind from a terrible fate. And that greatest generation accomplished a lot. Well, okay, they accomplished a lot because they were pretty much practicing MMT, that they were not constrained by, financial dogmas of the past, that they were willing to spend what needed to be spent in their time to make sure the world was going to be a better place for everyone else in the future.
Okay, so I completely agree with that, of course. And here's a little more complicated version of the same thing for maybe a 2-minute answer or so, if you have 2 minutes to answer it with. Mm-hmm. And the language there is how you're going to pay for your programs. Answer: at the end of every money bill, we'll order the Fed to increase the balance in the Treasury's account by the amount that we've ordered it to spend. We'll also order the Fed to increase the same balance by enough to cancel the portion of the national debt falling due during the period it's covered by our spending, unquote. And then sort of an explanatory sentence. So that will fund new spending and also reduce parts of the debt as as we go along until it is eventually gone.
So let me ask you this, Joe. That means that the Fed will essentially be buying up our debt, like a constant QE program in a way.
Well, not really buying up our debt, okay, because the Fed won't own the debt. In other words, the Treasury, as usual, will be paying the debt off. It will just always have the money to do so because the Fed will have given the money, placed it, created the money directly in the Treasury spending account using keystrokes. Mm-hmm. Okay, the way it normally creates money. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the objective, okay, of doing this in this way is to make absolutely transparent to people that in accord with the Constitution, it is the Congress that creates and spends the money of the United States.
Right, and the Fed should be taking the orders from the Congress. That's the way it should work.
Well, the Fed is a creature of Congress. Uh-oh. I don't know what happened.
Joe?
Yes, you're back.
I lost you for a second. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
I don't know what happened either.
Yeah.
Okay, but in any case, the Fed is the creature, okay, of the Congress. Okay, and but right now, Congress does not completely treat it as though it is an arm of the Congress.
Right.
So when it mandates the executive branch to spend a certain amount, when it mandates, as it does, the executive branch to always pay off the debt when it becomes due, it does not at the same time automatically provide the money to do this right into the Treasury account when the spending bills are passed. Mm-hmm. That's the situation, okay, that I want to create.
Right. I know we spoke about this last time.
Right. And that would kill the pay-go system.
Absolutely. And the pay-as-you-go system needs to be killed. I've been aware of this for so long, Joe. You know, I used to work on Capitol Hill for Paul Tsongas. I'm sorry, sorry about that. Tsongas was a senator from Massachusetts. And, you know, he was a good liberal, but his economics were turning away from the New Deal tradition. He joined with Warren Rudman and created the Concord Coalition. And they were all about balancing the budget like it was the most important thing in the world. And that certainly was not my view at the time, and it has not been since. So getting rid of the pay-as-you-go.
Right. And the third co-founder of that, by the way, was Peter G. Peterson.
Exactly.
There was a third co-founder. Right. So Peterson was right in it.
Right. I know. Well, it's exciting to see MMT spreading in influence, thanks to you and Real Progressives and Steve Grumbine and others. And I do think it's setting the stage for some big changes down the road.
I do too. Okay, and I think hopefully we're going to see those big changes in the next 2, 3, 4 years, depending upon how quickly the public actually acts.
Right.
Okay, there was one other issue, okay, that I wanted to bring up because it has come to prominence, okay, of late in our circles.
Yes.
It's been suggested that it's so important to have our progressives actually win office, mm-hmm. That if there's no other way to do it, okay, and they have to lie to do it, then it's okay to lie to win an election. In other words, it's preferable for progressives to lie to win elections than just to continue to lose elections to the right wing. Okay. Anyway, how do you feel about that?
I don't think we need to lie to the American people to win elections at all. I think on issue after issue, the American people are right with us progressives, overwhelming majorities. I see this in Florida. When I was on the ballot in August of 2016, we had two referendums statewide on the ballot. One was solar energy, and one was medicinal marijuana. And on both of those, they needed supermajorities of 60% or more statewide to pass. We didn't have those supermajorities with just weeks to go before the ballots were going to be cast. All the big corporate interests were spending heavily against those referendums. The fossil fuel industry spending tens of millions of dollars against the solar referendum. The big drug companies spending millions of dollars against the medicinal marijuana referendum. But we spoke the truth. Progressives stood up and spoke the truth. They didn't lie about anything. And social media came alive, and the public became more aware and awake. If we awaken the public, the right things will happen. And both of those referendums passed with over 70% of the vote statewide. People said it couldn't be done in Florida. It was. On issue after issue, the people are so far ahead of the political class. We don't need to lie. We need to be speaking the truth more forcefully, louder than ever before. I don't understand the whole idea that you got to lie about something. What are the
way, that it's normally put, or the way that anyway has been put to us, to RP is that if you have a progressive who's running in a hard red kind of district, and that candidate feels that the only way for them to win is to lie to their voters, then it's not up to other progressives to question what that particular candidate is actually doing. And the counterposition to this is, in other words, it takes the moral dilemma, as kind of a given, which is, of course, not necessarily the case, as you point out. It may not come down to such a stark choice.
Right. I would suggest
we basically take the moral dilemma, as given, and what we say is, because we felt we had to lie about things to constituents, or because Democrats felt they had to lie about things to citizens, or to shade things, from citizens, and Republicans felt the same. We now have arrived at a situation where we have a political system which is based on lies and which has undermined our democracy.
That is my view.
As a result.
Yeah.
And so, if we want to build a new system and we want to get out of this problem, it's a necessity that we never lie to voters, that we always tell the truth.
That is my view. When you start saying you're going to lie to the voters, that sounds a lot like Hillary Clinton saying, I've got one message for the voters, for the public, and another for my private donors. And if you're in a red district and you're fighting for progressive values, that progressive agenda is going to appeal to a lot of that populist right. After all, look at the similarities between what Trump was campaigning on and what Bernie Sanders was. Hostility to the Trans-Pacific Partnership was, prime example. The idea that the economy is underperforming and we need infrastructure and jobs, better trade programs, all that is going to appeal to the voters. And, I'm reminded time and again of the late, great Paul Wellstone. Wellstone was a U.S. Senator from Minnesota, and it pains me how few young people remember Paul Wellstone. They wouldn't remember him. They're too young. They're too young. But Paul Wellstone was a senator from Minnesota, and in the fall of 2002, George W. Bush demanded that Congress vote on whether we go to war against Iraq or not on these trumped-up charges of weapons of mass destruction. And all the public opinion polls in the U.S. were showing that supermajorities, about 60% of the public, believed the weapons of mass destruction narrative and wanted war. They approved of an authorization to go to war against Saddam Hussein. And that included in Paul Wellstone's state of Minnesota. And he was up for re-election in a tough contest. And he didn't back down. He told the truth to his constituents. he voted against public opinion. He voted against that war resolution. And in the days after that vote, he started to surge in the polls. What does it tell you about the voters? The voters will respect integrity. The voters don't expect their politicians to agree with them on each and every issue, but they want a politician who's got integrity. They want representatives who have integrity, and that was Wellstone. And unfortunately, Wellstone and his wife and daughter and a few others went down in a small plane crash, and all perished right at the same time that all was unfolding. And had he lived, had he not been killed, I think Paul Wellstone would have been the Democratic nominee in 2004. Other than, John Kerry had voted for the war, Paul Wellstone had not. And,
yes.
He would have been the future of the party. But I raise him as an example that we have to have confidence and faith in our values and our vision. And we've got to preach it. And if we seem like we're out of step, the public, well, let's bring the public along. Let's explain to them why we need a public sector that works for everyone. Let's not just cower in the corner and say, oh, God, everyone's talking about markets and markets and markets. I'm afraid to talk about the need for public financing of waterworks and transportation infrastructure in K-12. No, make the case. Public opinion will come around. They'll see. They will see. They'll come around. I truly believe that.
Yes, absolutely. I believe that too. I think that that is the democratic way. We cannot expect to build a democracy on a pack of lies. Mm-hmm. And to suggest, that we can do that is just to ignore history, I think. Okay.
And to ignore the historical moment we're in. People,
right. And to ignore the moment, that we're in. Yeah. We have to put aside lies.
Yeah. The divide today. What are the biggest divides today? I don't even see them as left versus right, Republican versus conservative versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative. It's basically integrity versus corruption. We're living in a very corrupt time right now, where it seems like everything and everyone could be for sale. And the voters are sick and tired of it. That's why they don't vote. And we have to be true to ourselves, and we've got to be true to the voters. There's no place for lying to them to pander for votes. Otherwise, we're just going to be, that's what the system is. We can't join the system if we want to change it.
Okay, so some of the people who are suggesting to us that sometimes, it's okay to lie, are fairly sophisticated people. So they go to some theories of epistemology, which are fairly sophisticated, and they dredge up none other than Jürgen Habermas, the hermeneutician and constructivist from Germany, who was a lion in terms of the philosophy of the times in Europe during the 1970s. He was a lion, among the philosophers, of Europe, but during the 1970s and 1980s.
Well, Habermas had a lot of interesting ideas that I agree with about the need for more pluralistic representation in our government, for instance.
Yeah, me too.
I honestly don't recall him talking about lion. Even if he was a lion, he wasn't talking about lion. At least I didn't hear that.
Okay. Well, when I said he was a lion, I meant L-I.
I know. I'm just
O-N. I wasn't suggesting, that Habermas was a liar.
I know. I'm just teasing you.
Anyway,
I'm just teasing you, Joe.
I think he was extremely serious.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to make that clear. But what he did often write about was that there's not a single version of the truth. There are many versions of the truth, and that we have to consider many versions of the truth. Mm-hmm. And he did not subscribe to a correspondence theory of truth, that our language can actually correspond in some way to a state of affairs that is a true state of affairs. Right. Now, of course, Karl Popper actually opposed that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of his philosophy that was constructivist in a certain way, but when it came down to the theory of truth, he was a correspondence theorist.
Mm-hmm.
And he had famous debates during the 1980s with Habermas and other people in that school. Okay, he went over to Europe, okay, and he debated them. And those were very, very classic debates. And the difference still comes down to us but today. The common sense theory of truth is a correspondence theory of truth. Okay, people essentially believe that we can say things that are true and that they correspond to what is in the world. Okay, but there are other people who don't actually believe that, and they think that truth is internal to how we construct things in our minds, okay, and in what we say, okay, our language in text.
Right, right.
Okay?
So, Joe, my view is that there are objective truths. How many people are unemployed? What's it going to take to get them working again? There are objective truths. But I do think that people arrive at those truths from many different paths at very different speeds sometimes. And it means that as educators or as candidates, when we're trying to argue a position and bring people along to see the truth the way we see it, there are many different ways to convince people.
Yes, there are. And when we're dealing with people, we have to take a critical approach, not only to their views, okay, but to our views. Mm-hmm. We have to recognize the possibility that their views are correct and our views are not. And so we have to be open to what they say and to entertain what they say in an honest way.
Right.
But that does not mean that there are many versions of the truth. Okay. Right. And that also does not mean that we ought to be silent or condoning when we know someone is telling a lie in the sense that they do not believe what they are saying.
Right. And that's different from somebody who's speaking, thinking they're speaking truthfully, but you see them as being flawed in their perception. And it doesn't do us any good to call those people deplorable and to beat them up and to demonize them. This country moves forward if it has honest discussions and, you know, the marketplace of ideas. If the ideas are expressed in a constructive way where we're not demonizing the messenger, we might be disagreeing with the message. I think it's that clash of ideas and that brotherly, fraternal, sisterly discussion will lead people to come around and there'll be broader consensus in society, I think. But that's not the kind of communication system we have anymore, is it?
No, it's not.
No, it's a lot of talking heads talking past each other on the corporate mass media. I do think there's more opportunity for the kinds of discussions we need in these kinds of platforms that you host and that others host as well.
Yes, and the mass media platforms, in those very platforms, it seems like it's become a common sort of understanding within the mainstream of the media that there are many versions of the truth, okay, and that therefore one person's view is just as good as another person's view, and that it's the job of the reporters always to simply report what one person says and what the other person says. And perhaps they oversimplify a little by always thinking that there are only two views of the world.
Right.
And they end up essentially giving you only two views of the world.
Right.
But they don't feel that it's their place, not even in the editorials they write, to assert that something is true and something else is false.
I think that's the role of a candidate. Some might say a professor should do it, an academic should. Others would say no. But I am convinced that a candidate is, even if you realize that your view might not comply with some people who are in the audience listening to you, I think it's incumbent upon the candidate to state their view persuasively and try to bring people around. You can't be on the defensive about it. You've got to be out there making the arguments. And that's, I think, a burden, but a responsibility also of leadership and of candidates.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot here tonight, and I think a lot that was very important. Let's take a brief time, okay, and entertain some questions and some comments, okay?
Okay, that'd be great.
Not for too long a time this time, okay? Jeffrey Hyde says, the reason I stopped watching the about corporate media is that they try to enforce on us YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook to watch them, or we get censored. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but would you like to comment on it?
I'm not quite sure what he meant either. That the corporate media is doing what with social media?
He said he no longer watches the corporate media. I may have part of what he said actually wiped out a little here. I don't know why. What I'm going to do is put what he said up on the screen.
Well, I'll tell you this. I watch a lot less corporate media than I did 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 2 months ago.
Wait. I think I understand what he's saying. He says they try to enforce what we say on YouTube, on Twitter, okay, and on Facebook by essentially referring to the corporate media, okay, and basically in the end, looking to what the corporate media has to say as the standard, okay, of truth, and that these social media platforms are increasingly doing that.
Yeah, I see what
so they themselves become the captives of the corporate media. I think that's what Jeffrey Hyde was suggesting.
I think he also suggested that there's a degree of censorship beginning to happen on social media.
Yes, he did.
And that is, I see that happening. These are the algorithms of the social media companies that are beginning to remove followers from progressive sites, whether it's progressive reporters, journalists, or candidates like me. So to me, I find this very troubling. You've got these oligarchs who are essentially able to censor speech, stifle speech, throttle speech in what are basically public forums at this point, and they should be treated as public forums. It's not any real answer to say, well, that's a privately owned company. These privately owned companies wouldn't have an internet if it weren't for the enormous public investment that went in through DARPA, the defense program, research program that invented the internet. Yes. All kinds of public outlays, public spending that created the conditions for the internet to exist. This is truly public forums that we're talking over right now. And the idea that some oligarch can assert some property right and start trying to stifle our speech is un-American and outlandish to me. And if it means beginning to regulate these social media giants like they're monopolies or oligopolies or monopolistic, maybe that's where we should be heading. Right.
I completely agree. We need to apply the antitrust laws.
Exactly.
We need to apply the antitrust laws, and we need to refine them. And we've not been doing it. We've not been doing it at all, and that's one way in which we've been destroying our democracy.
Yes.
In a very important way. Okay, we have a comment. Since you are an independent, Tim.
Yes, I like that.
What are the donation maximums? Is it $2,700 for the primary and $2,700 for the general?
My understanding is there's no primary now. I'll be on the ballot, the general election ballot in November, and that means that it's a $2,700 limit, period. It's not $2,700 for a primary and then $2,700 for a general election. It's just $2,700 once. If there's any folks there who are doing well and they can write a check or go online and contribute $2,700, we welcome that, no doubt. Our average contribution size last campaign, I think, was $17. Right now, I think it's just over $20. We saw an upsurge in donations at our website at timcanova.com in the days following, and it's sustaining itself in the days following my announcement that we're running as an independent this time. And it's wonderful to see this upsurge in support. We're up against a big corporate machine. Wasserman Schultz's corporate fundraising did not lag at all. These corporations have rallied around her, these special interests, and we have a job ahead of us. We've got so many volunteers in the district. We've got great name recognition. We got the issues on our side. We gave one hell of a run last time and lost under very suspicious circumstances now. I think our chances of winning in November are fantastic, but we do need resources, and I'm urging folks to go online. I know most people can't afford $2,700. I certainly can't for somebody else's campaign. I've thrown a lot of my own money into this campaign. But if folks can afford $5, $10, $20, $50, $100, whatever they can afford, please give what you can. I'm out there fighting for the people, and folks know that. We're going to keep fighting for our agenda. We're not going to bow down at all.
Okay, so would you like to say what the link is for donations?
Sure, it's timcanova.com.
Okay.
Okay, and right now we still have Act Blue as our platform, but we are in the process of transitioning off of Act Blue within the next 2 weeks. So if folks can give right now, just know that soon we'll be changing from Act Blue. If you want to send checks, you could always send checks to our campaign headquarters at 2028 Harrison Street, Hollywood, Florida, 33019, to timcanova.com. But otherwise, please go online to timcanova.com, contribute what you can, and in a couple of weeks, we'll have a new payment platform on timcanova.com. We raised a lot of money in small donations last campaign. In fact, according to Huffington Post, we broke all records in American political history for the highest percentage of small online donations of any campaign for federal office, any federal office. And what did we do with that money? You know, we didn't just spend it on the same old type of political consulting class. We rejected a lot of that. I opened 4 field offices in our district. We had more than 50 full-time field organizers and deputy field organizers, so many that we had to rent 2 houses for them to live in. And we had, I think, close to 200 volunteers, all of us knocking on doors in the heat and humidity of the summer of 2016. And at the height of the campaign, we were knocking on 10,000 to 12,000 doors a week and calling almost 3,000 people a week. That was a much larger sample size than the pollsters who call 400 or 500 people on landlines. And we really, you know, we either came very close in a short amount of time. I was a candidate for less than 8 months against a powerful machine, or there was, you know, some kind of election rigging going on. And unfortunately, we'll probably never know now that the paper ballots were destroyed. But these folks know, the election officials must know at this point that we are ready to sue on day one and challenge any election result where we don't win. There's no reason to give any credence to the electronic voting machines anymore. They all admit that they can be hacked. It's not just the Russians or foreign powers that can hack them. The New York Times just had a magazine piece called "The Myth of the Hacker-Proof Voting Machine." What this country needs even more than campaign finance reform is a system of 100% paper ballots counted by hand in public on election evening and reported at the local precinct level immediately on election evening. And the only thing stopping us, standing in the way, are what? Financial resources? I mean, this is maybe a good way to wrap up on real progressives and talking about MMT.
Yes.
The federal government can afford a $1.5 trillion tax cut. The Federal Reserve can afford $4 trillion in quantitative easing programs. The federal government can have $3 to $4 trillion of corporate subsidies a year. Certainly, it can afford to spend a few $1 billion to hire however many Americans are needed, maybe 100,000, who knows, however many are needed, to do their civic duty and count ballots in public by hand on election night, the way it was done for 2 centuries in this country, and make sure that we have transparent and verifiable elections so that there's no doubt in anybody's mind that their votes are being counted. That's
absolutely.
That's the way to restore our democracy. That's the way to ensure public confidence and participation in our election system. And that's got to be one of the top issues. I always say that what we have here is a movement of movements. You know, we've got an MMT movement. We've got an environmental movement. The environmental movement has several movements within it: pipelines, fracking, climate change. We've got a movement for racial justice, a movement to end the war on drugs and mass incarceration. These are all part of the larger progressive movement, a movement of movements. But we won't make any progress on any of these until we have fair elections that we can verify and that are transparent. For that, we need paper ballots. I urge folks to make this a top priority, whatever movement you're in.
And so do I. Okay, and on that note, okay, I think we should say goodnight because we've been here for an hour and 22 minutes.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, Joe. It's always a pleasure meeting with you. And
thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you. And all those folks out there on Real Progressives, I love you all, and I'm with you. And I know you guys are there for me, and I so much appreciate it. You spoke earlier about whether politicians should lie or not, and I got to say that because I take money from the people and I push a people's agenda, I don't have to lie about any issues. The one thing I got to lie about sometimes are my spirits. It's easy to get down and you can't show it when you're a candidate. And, the thing that keeps me going is the kind of encouragement I get from grassroots folks. And, I just want to say my thanks to everybody who's out there pulling for me.
Well, we are certainly pulling for you. And we're pulling for a number of other candidates also around the country. Steve Jaffe, for example.
Steve Jaffe, for example, great candidate, absolutely great candidate. I'm hoping he's in a runoff against Nancy Pelosi. What a different candidate from Nancy Pelosi. Absolutely. Amen on Steve Jaffe. Go on. There's a whole list of them, and I want to be part of it. I want to be helping these folks. To me, it doesn't matter if they're running as Democrats, progressives, Greens, libertarians. As long as they're progressive, as long as they've got the people's back, as long as they're not taking corporate money and they're pushing our grassroots agenda, I'm for them, and I'll do whatever I can to help them.
Right, Tim. I completely agree with you about all that, and Real Progressives completely agrees with you also on that as well. Okay.
Well, thanks. And here in Florida, we've got some great candidates also. In neighboring districts, people like Alina Valdez and Stephen Michaud. Stephanie Myers is running for a state legislative position. Tamika Lyles for a Senate seat. There's lots of great candidates who are out there against all odds, fighting sort of similar David versus Goliath battles, and they're not giving up. And I'm so proud of them for not giving up.
Okay, Tim. Okay, so I'll say goodnight to you now.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay, and I'll be ending in just a minute myself. Okay, and I appreciate it.
Look forward to next time.
As well. Okay, anytime you want to come back.
I'll be back soon. We'll have I'll tell you, April came in like a lion for us, announcing we're running as independents. We've got some big news that's going to break later, I think. My mom used to say, where I grew up, April comes in like a lion and out like a lamb. Do you remember that saying?
Yeah, but it was not about April. It was about March.
Oh, when I was growing up, they said it about April. April comes in like a lion and out like a lamb. And, of course, they're talking about the weather, right? It comes in with harsh weather and it goes out real nice and spring-like. Well, April came in like a lion. We're going to make sure it goes out like a freaking dragon. So the campaign's going to keep building up a lot of momentum, and I'm looking forward to coming back and speaking with you during the campaign.
Okay, that's a great slogan. Let's make sure it goes out like a freaking dragon.
Thank you, brother.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Okay, so folks, I just wanted to say in closing, because I do have to close. Do not forget, Real Progressives has a Patreon page, and we always appreciate a donation there. And I have a Patreon page also, and I also always appreciate a donation, okay, at that page. And so thank you very much for attending. I hope you had a good time tonight. I certainly did. And I'll see you next time, which for me will be next Thursday at 9 p.m. And I'm going to be interviewing Angelica Earl, who is running for the Senate against Claire McCaskill in Missouri. And she is another important race, and we want to see her win too. So take care, okay, and good night.